Hello and welcome to our fourth Health Services Researcher interview. My name is Rachel Morton and I'm a Professor of Health Economics at the University of Sydney and President of the Health Services Research Association of Australia and New Zealand, or HSRAANZ for short. Our interviews have been focusing on HSR during COVID-19, the health system's response required to manage the pandemic and its aftermath, and how we can minimise the collateral damage and even implement pandemic-driven improvements. My guest today is Professor Dorothy Keefe. Professor Keefe is the CEO of Cancer Australia and an honorary clinical professor in the School of Medicine at the University of Adelaide. She's had a long career as a medical oncologist and professor of cancer medicine, and her areas of expertise include gastrointestinal toxicity of cancer treatment, supportive care in cancer, and more broadly, medical leadership and health reform. She's published extensively in the supportive care literature and has a long-standing commitment to the Multinational Association of Supportive Care in Cancer and is their past president. All her work is focused on improving outcomes for patients. Dorothy, thank you very much for joining us today. Can you begin by giving us a little bit about your professional and research background and your clinical or research interests?
Thank you, Rachel. It's lovely to be here. It's always very pleasant to talk about important areas of health service research and things that make outcomes better. I've had a very enjoyable career as a medical oncologist with an interest in supportive care in cancer. And it's always been lovely to be able to say that, you know, we poison people for a living, but we try and do it in the nicest possible way. I hope that's not considered offensive. I do say that to my patients as well. The drugs that we use and some of the other treatments that we use are very toxic. And I think it's been a really rewarding career to spend my life trying to reduce those toxicities of cancer treatments. And that developed into a lifelong interest in gastrointestinal toxicity and then more broadly into supportive care. And I suspect that having that particular interest in how the patient felt about it and what the impact of our treatments was on the patient as well as on the tumour actually then enabled me to broaden my career into looking at system issues. And I had the great fortune to be offered a role working for the Health Minister in South Australia looking at health reform more broadly. And then, of course, able to combine all of those interests into my current role as the CEO of Cancer Australia.
Right, terrific. So in your role as the CEO of Cancer Australia, I saw that Cancer Australia has released a report about how COVID-19 has disrupted and challenged, but also really inserted a rationale for change and a catalyst for change in cancer services. What's your impression of how COVID-19 has challenged cancer care and also cancer research?
Well, I think it's COVID-19 has challenged everybody across the health system in every aspect. And I feel very privileged to be able to talk about the impacts on cancer, but I'm not reducing in any way my understanding that it's affected everything. But of course, at the beginning of the pandemic, we didn't know whether having cancer and having cancer treatment would put people at huge risk of morbidity and death from COVID-19. And we didn't know how badly Australia would fare during the pandemic. I think it was true to say that while we've all known for all of our careers that a pandemic could happen at any time, we never really believed it would. And we hadn't prepared in the way that we might. So Cancer Australia took stock at the beginning really and said, okay, what can we do that is valuable? Where's our value add to the system around COVID-19 and cancer? And we decided that we wanted to look at things that nobody else would be in a position to do. Each jurisdiction clearly has done fabulous work in this area, but it has been jurisdictional and each craft group has looked at issues affecting their craft group. So we said, okay, where will we be able to help? And what we looked at first of all, the very first thing was we decided to collate and curate on our website every article that was published in in cancer and COVID, so that people would have somewhere to go, so that clinicians, researchers, the general population would be able to say, here's somewhere that we can look at that brings everything together, because the literature started off very low quality case reports and got better and better as time went by. So that was the first thing. And then we developed a framework for how one should think about managing cancer during a pandemic. So we said, okay, if we had known this at the beginning, that this was coming, and we've been able to think about every stage of the cancer journey, prevention and screening, diagnostics, treatment, survivorship, palliative care, what would the impact of a severe pandemic curve or a moderate pandemic curve be on the way you should provide those services? And it's all about, obviously, not overwhelming your health system while optimizing cancer outcomes, because of course if you delay cancer treatment, depending on the cancer, that can have catastrophic consequences. So that was a really interesting thought piece that enabled us to say, well, you should only stop treatment if it's safe to stop treatment, but you can only continue to give very toxic treatment if your health service isn't overwhelmed. So we looked at different curves. And then having done that, we decided that what we probably needed to do next was look at what had changed across the country and across all of those areas of the cancer journey, and say, are those changes good, bad, or indifferent? And should we keep them after the pandemic or not? So, for example, the telehealth issue. Telehealth has come in, absolutely marvellous. A 10-year policy plan has been activated in 2 weeks, and suddenly everyone is doing telehealth. But they're not all doing telehealth by video.
No, telephone as well.
And 98% by telephone.
Wow, I didn't realise it was that high.
It's huge. And so you have to say to yourself, yes, I know we're very good at eliciting information by phone and communicating by phone, but it isn't as good. So if we're going to keep telehealth, which we all support, then we should keep telehealth as excellent telehealth, not as substandard telehealth. So we really need to work in that area. So this is the sort of thing that we've been occupied with during COVID. And I think you also asked about research, but I'm happy to talk about that as a separate issue.
Yeah, we'll come back to research in a minute. What about then things like virtual multidisciplinary team meetings, which are sort of a cornerstone of cancer care? Do you have a sense of how they're working when clinicians can't be in one room together?
Well, again, I think there are pluses and minuses of virtual MDT. And if you listen to many clinicians, they'll tell you how effective they are, how brilliant it is that you don't have to drive in, find somewhere to park, etc. It takes up much less time of your day. One can be much more efficient. The problem is that hasn't told us whether it's better for the patient, because we haven't actually asked that question. So my interest in video conferencing MDTs is to say, okay, how do we measure whether that is leading to better outcomes and better decisions for patients? So obviously in a virtual MDT, you don't have the patient there at all. Now we know there's a mixture across the country of whether you don't, but that's one thing you definitely wouldn't have. But the other thing is, did we make a quick decision or did we make a good decision?
Right. And so does Cancer Australia have a role then in wanting to answer those questions, evaluating some of the new systems? Or does the organisation put forward research funds for others to do that? Is that something that the organisation is thinking about?
I think the answer is that we do both. So one of the things that we did in our recovery piece was we looked at, as I said, all of those different areas. There were 12 different areas that we looked at of changes. And then we looked at the evidence, and then we brought a group of experts from around the country together for it was a bit like speed dating. We had 30 people on a Zoom meeting because everybody said yes, because everyone's actually really interested in this. Multidisciplinary, every sort of person. And we talked through all of these issues and said, so what do you think, what should we do? And that's, I think, it's just about to be published. I think there's a paper coming out. So my view is very strongly that everything that Cancer Australia does is only useful insofar as we publish it and implement it. So we have a really important role in working with each jurisdiction and with the jurisdictions combined to ensure that this good work is enabled. So where we have funds, and of course we, like everyone else, we don't have lots of money. Where we have funds, we use them to partner with either all the jurisdictions together or a jurisdiction particularly that has an interest to further a piece of work.
Okay. Yes. Yeah.
For example, one of the things we did was because we don't have real-time data on cancer in Australia or on many others, and that's one of the other things we need to fix. So what we thought was, we can't get the real data. Let's measure the impacts on cancer diagnoses and treatment, in another way. And so we looked at MBS item numbers that would have been used for cancer diagnostics and treatment, and showed that there'd been a pretty impressive reduction in diagnosis and therapeutics for breast cancer, bowel cancer, and skin cancers in the early months of the pandemic. Now that
is the result of people not participating in national screening programs?
Well, not particularly. I think because this is MBS data, not screening data.
Yes.
So it looked at private and outpatients rather than at screening programs. The AIHW is about to publish the screening ones.
Right.
But I haven't seen that, but I believe it does exactly this. It shows exactly the same thing. It's a combination of people being afraid to go to the doctor and actually the system putting up the deflector shields. I hope that's not offensive to the system, but we were all in a bit of a panic at the beginning, and we didn't know how dangerous it was for people to come in or not come in. And we had a bit of mixed messaging, stay at home if you're not well, only go in if you really need to be seen. But of course, the poor patient doesn't know whether they really need to be seen or not. And so the messaging did turn out to be a bit of a deflection. And so I think that we've got to work on both of those. So again, what we did was Cancer Australia said, well, we can do something here. We ran a social media campaign called Cancer Won't Wait, which basically said, if you've got one of these symptoms, you need to go and be seen. And you need to ring the clinic and say, I need to come face to face, because we can't pick up everything by phone. And, go and do that. And then we put an interactive body map up on our website where you could actually press on the bit of the body and it would tell you what the symptoms were in that area that could be associated with cancer.
Right.
So we're trying to sort of get at all these gaps to enable the system to work smoothly.
Yeah. And what about something like Oncology Hospital in the Home? Was that a new program, or had that always existed? Did that help to provide treatment when people at home, when people were, afraid to come to a hospital or, a tertiary clinic?
So Hospital in the Home for oncology isn't new. It's just not very well developed across the country. So there have been home chemotherapy pilots, hither and yon, and some of the private companies are very keen on it. But of course, it has to be as safe as chemotherapy at the hospital or at the clinic. The Hospital in the Home aspect actually does more of the supportive care. So the two weren't necessarily linked. And I actually think this has given us an opportunity to look at what we're calling now a virtual oncology day centre, rather than just building on the old model. How about we flip it on its head and say, if you can have a virtual ICU with a central hub, and this of course comes out of my health reform work, not necessarily out of the oncology. Why can't you have a virtual oncology day centre with somebody sitting at the centre and having the two-way communication, the observation and whatever, and we were talking about having a home delivery pack that you'd have, and a bit like one of those recipe box deliveries where you'd say to the person in the station, this has happened, and they'd say, yes, open packet A and drink 3 whatevers, and you sort of think, actually this is the opportunity bit. Like the telehealth and the virtual MDTs, the opportunity to actually completely change the model in a disruptive way because it's faster.
And so you talked about the interface between care and research. With all of these sort of new or expanded initiatives, what sort of health services research do you think is needed? You talked a little bit about evaluation. What are some of the research questions you think we should be asking?
So I think health services research, again, it's one of these really vital things. You start off not realizing how important it is, and then realizing that it's central to everything. There's no point making a change in the way you manage healthcare if you don't evaluate it and don't ask the questions about whether it's valuable and whether it's ethical and whether it's improving people's lives at a reasonable rate. I think within cancer, as I said, there are these 12 areas that have changed already, all of which need to be
evaluated
and optimized. And, I used to say that medical oncology was a research specialty, but actually health is a research specialty. So I've taken that breadth further. And why would you not research pretty much everything? Of course, the only problem is that maybe the way we've been doing research also needs a disruptive change. And I don't have to... Sorry?
Can you sort of describe that a little bit more? What sorts of things are you thinking can help improve?
Well, this is a problem because I don't have the answers. This is a thought in process. But, if you go back to that, I think it's Albert Einstein quote that if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. If you always ask the same questions in the same way and have the same methodology for answering them, then you won't necessarily get any further. And so I think it is very useful on a regular basis, but not every time, because if you do it every time, you never get anywhere. But on a regular basis to say, are we asking the right question? Is there a better way of doing this? Is this particular question or this particular study going to answer the question we needed answered? One of my favorite things has always been saying, if you're preparing a clinical trial of a new drug, which, oncologists get fascinated by, I say, mock up some, write the abstract for presentation. Tell us what you did, why you did it, how you did it. Make up some results and come up with a conclusion. And then tell me whether actually you answered the question you were trying to answer in the first place, which often these trials don't do because they don't ask the important question. They ask the question that the drug company wants the answer to, or that somebody, So I think people with more input than me will have the ideas that can disrupt the way that it's done.
Just following on from that, Dorothy, do you see that consumers have a role in helping to shape some of the priorities or prioritised questions for research? Is there a bigger role for consumers to help make the design of clinical trials more relevant to the end users?
Look, I think we can't do anything without consumers because their view of what is happening to them is something that we can't actually fix. So it's just, Cancer Australia doesn't do anything without consumers. So when I talk about a group of experts, that is a group of experts that includes consumer experts because, being a consumer actually makes you an expert in this. Of course, you do have to balance, personal agendas, experiences, against what's good for everybody. But I think all research is enhanced by consumer involvement. It may be difficult, but that doesn't mean it isn't absolutely the right thing to do, and it always enhances what's going on. I mean, it is, after all, the consumers who matter in terms of quality as well as quantity of life. And I always think, as one gets older, one has, more reasons to occasionally attend a doctor. And every single time you think, oh my goodness, that's what people are going through. I find it fascinating that I once had to have an MRI of my spine, and I nearly pressed the panic button, you know. And but the reason for telling that story is that when I went back to my clinical practice, I reduced considerably the number of MRI scans I ordered on people, and I always counselled them about the claustrophobia.
Yes.
But if you've never, asked,
or had that personal experience to know the effect it has, look, absolutely fascinating, and we certainly commend Cancer Australia and many of the cancer organisations for their leadership in integrating consumers within the research process. Design, consultation, impact, importantly, equity as well. So I just wanted to ask a couple of other questions in terms of ensuring that there is appropriate funding for evaluating and knowing whether, in particular, these 12 platforms for enhanced cancer care as a response to the pandemic can be undertaken. What would you ask federal government or other international bodies, research funders, what would you say or ask for if you had a couple of minutes with them?
That's a really good question. I think I would say to them, stay the course. Don't see research funding as an easy cut in different times, because actually research is the future. And it's been very difficult during COVID. We've had some very interesting discussions about how people are unable to keep their track record accumulating, and how, particularly in Victoria, obviously there've been real problems around being able to be in a position where you can actually put in good enough competitive applications this year. So I would ask, I think, research funders to first of all to stay the course, but secondly to be kind. I think this is, and I know that might sound a bit naff, but kindness and compassion really will enhance where we end up. This has been an incredible year. It's not over. It's not even nearly over. We're still in the beginning of it. And so this is going to go on for years. And what we need to do is and our next piece of work is going to be how we develop life in the new, what they're calling COVID normal, which sounds really weird. And I don't quite know what it means. It only appeared as a term a couple of weeks ago, but we need to make sure that research, not just into COVID, but into everything else that's been impacted, which is the whole of health services, needs to be continued. And research stimulates the economy, and we need to stimulate the economy. And I'm fascinated by the fact that the countries with the worst health impacts have had the biggest economic problems. So if you keep your health, you need to keep them both together, and they are intertwined, and research money is a really important part of that.
Absolutely. So Cancer Australia is a corporate member of the HSRAANZ. And speaking about kindness and compassion, I guess that can extend to, looking after each other as researchers. What do you see as the benefits of communities of practice like these associations, particularly during times of, research funding uncertainty and job insecurity?
I think they're absolutely vital, and I think that you're right. It's about having people and organisations that you can turn to, where you feel safe to talk about the problems and you feel supported. And I mean, after all, they were set up as support mechanisms, really, weren't they? And as funding, enablers, etc. And so I think they've taken on an extra dimension almost with this into crisis care for our people. Resilience is really important. This pandemic is building resilience in many and showing up gaps in resilience in others. Fascinating that cancer patients seem to be very resilient. I think they've already had their worst life-threatening nightmare. So this is just another one, and they sort of switch into crisis management mode, as do we. And I think that it's just really important. Talking therapies are really important, and so having a group that understands you to enable that to happen is really important. I think one of the big problems that we have is the enabling of the next generation of young researchers to join in the national and international research communities,
right?
The way that we have been able to. You know, Zoom is fantastic. It's a bit wearying, but it is fantastic that we can still communicate. You know, imagine what it would have been like in 1919. But you know, my first research friend and mentor I met 30 years ago, and we are still in constant contact. And we have done research together, health services research together, supportive care research together, dined all over the world, met many, many people who have enhanced my research. I feel really sad that there's a group that is going to miss out on that. And I think one of the roles of the societies is actually to find ways to enable those people to meet.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And that's, I think that's a very good plug for mentoring, not only for early career researchers, but also to support mid-career researchers, particularly during this time. Excellent. Dorothy, thank you very much for your time today. It's been a wonderful interview and very insightful in terms of the changes affecting cancer care and research. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. It's been an absolute pleasure.